It's time to talk about managing users and also about user roles, which is a big subject. So let's start simple and just go to the users link in our primary navigation. And here again is that list view that we've talked about before. And it's interesting, what you see in this list view is you can see the user's name, and you can also see their email address, and you can see when they last logged in. Now this could be really useful if maybe you're enrolling some family caregivers to participate in GrandCare for their older or disabled loved one. You can see if they've never logged in, and you might want to contact them again and say, I see you haven't logged in, maybe you need some help. And you can also see the role that they have, and in some cases you'll see that that they would have multiple roles. That's typical for people who work at GrandCare and maybe in your organization as well. But for a family caregiver, you would see their one and only role that they have listed here in list view. And you can click right through on any of these users in the list to see their user info page, where you can see when they last logged in. And also, we'll talk about this a little bit later when we create a new user, their expired date, which means the date at which their account here in GC Manage will not be valid to use anymore. And we'll talk about what that means in a bit. Lots to go over here. There's the edit function, which is really the same form that you would see when you create a new user, and we'll do that in a minute. Let me just go back. This user's never logged in, so what you might want to do is resend their activation email, which if you were paying attention earlier in the class, you may know that they can do that themselves if they go to the lost password function at the login screen and put in the email address that you've used to create their account. They can get that email sent to them so that they can establish a password and do the user license agreement and all that sort of stuff that you do when you first create your account. Also, there's this tab here for roles, and here's where you'll see the roles that they have. And I do say roles plural because you might have more than one. And in the case of a communicator, they can either be alertable or not alertable. That is to say, a communicator is a role that might or might not be someone that you could target in an alert, like for a rule, like grandma didn't take her blood pressure. Do you want this person to be selectable as a contact to get a text message or an email about that? We'll talk more about roles in a little bit. And then, of course, here's the log of activity on this user. That might be helpful to troubleshoot some stuff sometimes too. So let's add a new user. This is pretty simple stuff. Let's add incidentally, if you don't know this trick, if you have Gmail of any kind, even if it's gmail.com, or even if it's in our case grandcare.com email is managed by Gmail. So if you have a Gmail address, email address of any kind, and you quick need an alias for it, like I'll make a new user, but of course S. Feldstein at grandcare.com already is a user on here, so what do? You could go and maybe make a new phony email address that you'll never use again, or you can do your name and then a plus sign and then something beyond that, like a number 1 or a word or whatever it is, and then the rest of your email addresses you would do, and that'll automatically land in your normal inbox. But for the purposes of GC Manage, it'll be recognized as a new person. So I'll just give myself a phony last name here for a second. Now I could upload a picture. We've talked about doing that before. When you looked at your My Profile. This is the exact same thing as looking at My Profile, only it's not you, it's somebody else. Typically, you wouldn't have a picture of them to put up here, that they would typically have to do that themselves. But you might have their address that you could put on, and make sure to get their city and state and their zip code, maybe who they work for if they're an organizational user of that type. It's a good idea to have their cell number, as I mentioned before, so that GrandCare could call their cell phone, but also can text them. And then also there's this widget here that we didn't talk about before. That's a little checkbox labeled "Text me when I miss a video call." So on the face of it, that's a pretty simple to understand idea here, that if a GrandCare touchscreen user tries to place a video call to you from their touchscreen and you don't answer it, this will send you a text message immediately after the call has failed to tell you that this GrandCare touchscreen user has tried to call you. But in addition to that, it will also make sure, if you check this, it will mean that your name is active to try to video call at all times on that touchscreen, whereas otherwise it would only be active and listed there for you to be called if you were logged in to the Care portal here. More on that in a little bit. And we don't use Skype anymore. Now here's an interesting idea that we haven't talked about yet, and we will talk about it in a separate area of the class, but a touchscreen pin. As you may know, GrandCare touchscreens usually have their settings protected by a pin number, and typically that number is 1111, although it can be changed to anything you like in the Care menu. So what is a touchscreen pin? Well, it's for people who are providing care on site, that is, at the site of the touchscreen. So it could be an in-home caregiver, and that caregiver might want to clock in using the GrandCare touchscreen, and they might want to document what cares they have delivered while they were there on their shift, and they might want to clock out when they're done. And it's a great feature, and the way that they identify themselves as themselves is that they use this pin to log in at the caregiving button on the touchscreen. If anyone touches the caregiving button there, they would be asked for their touchscreen pin to identify who they are. Now I could put some notes about who this person is if I want to, but the most important thing I think going on in this entire add a user form is that you want to select the role that's appropriate for them. The default one is account caregiver, and then to go along with that, you must select the correct account. That would be really, really bad if you accidentally provided somebody a role, especially a caregiver role or above, to the wrong account. That would likely be something that you would want to call GrandCare about right away, so that we could troubleshoot that with you and decide whether or not that we needed to report that as a potential HIPAA violation. And as been mentioned before, by the way, that we would much rather report these type of incidents than not report them. Typically what regulators are looking for is that we're following a procedure when these things happen. It's not so much that they're mad at us that they happened. These things do happen on occasion. And you should have a process in place to minimize that, and a process in place for what you do when they do occur. And basically what regulators are looking at us for, and possibly to you, is that do you have a process and are you following it? In fact, they'd likely be suspicious if you never had anything to report. So it's not a bad thing to have a reportable incident and to talk to us about it. So never fear. If you're in doubt, let us know and we'll decide together what's the best way forward. Now, having selected the right role, and we're going to talk about all of these roles and exactly what they mean in just a little bit, so hold tight. But in the meantime, if you just want to know a little bit about what that role is, there's this great big blue bar right under it to give you the role description. And you can see in this case, an account caregiver has full access to the caregiver menu or the care menu for their assigned account and for all residents on that account. And speaking of accounts, we must select the account that we want to give them that role in. And so we could select anything, I guess anything we want here. This is, of course, our development environment, so there's quite a bit of nonsense in our account names. But we'll just give them the caregiver role on that account here. Now, you do want to give them the right time zone. And of course, there's an option to choose what language that they would speak, or what language that GC Manage would be in for them. And there's some other choices here that I think are pretty self-explanatory. Now, here's that expiration date. Now, the only reason that I've ever used this, and I guess your mileage may vary, but I've only ever used this if I had maybe a potential customer who I wanted them to have access to GC Manage so that they could poke around at it and look at it and become familiar with it, but that they don't have a legitimate ongoing role in GrandCare of any kinds. So I might put an expiration date of next month, and then just send them an email saying that in addition to receiving their activation email, as this person will do once I submit this form, but then I would send them an email explaining that I've given you 3 weeks to look at this, so make sure that you do and let me know if you have any problems and so on. And then, when the appropriate date arrives, their account would expire. There's a place for additional notes. Then these notes actually go into the activation email. So I might put that here, that I might type in a message about how this, by the way, you can activate your account, but it's only good for another month. So if I save this user, I do get, I would get, and I will get an email, an activation email. And you can see here's all my relevant information and my address and when I last logged in, which is never, and when I expire, which is never, and so on. And you can see when you look at roles, there's the role that I have given this user for this account. Pretty simple. Now, what's not so simple is talking about roles. So let's look in some detail into user roles. So first, I don't know if I mentioned, but what do we mean by user? A user in the care portal is any person who can log in with an email address and a password. So I might discuss a touchscreen user or resident or a senior or any person like that, but those people would not be listed in the users area of GC Manage. Users are typically caregivers and administrators and people like that. So let's take a look at these roles. First of all, there are admin roles or administrative roles, and they can edit settings, view resident health information, access communications, and also manage users. Caregivers can't do all those things. They can view resident health information, access communications, and receive alerts and assessments. And notice, administrators don't receive alerts and assessments. See that? Caregivers can receive alerts and assessments. So that's one thing that the caregivers have over the admins. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if you're an administrator for an organization who has deployed hundreds of GrandCares, you don't really want to be targetable by that many by alerts in that many different GrandCare systems. If there's a particular one or two or a dozen that you do want to be targetable with alerts, then you can give yourself an additional role just on those systems, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. And finally, there's the communicator role, and that's the lowest role, as it were. That's just somebody who can view basic resident information but not health data, and they can access communications. So they can upload pictures and they can do a video call, but they're not going to see what your blood pressure is or anything like that. So here's another way to look at this too, because not only are there user roles, there's admins and caregivers and communicators, but there are also user levels. So, for example, An account is a level, and a group is a level, and a distributor is a level. Now here's what those mean. So if you are an account caregiver, it means that you have the caregiving role at that account level for an account. And alternately, you might have a group caregiver role, which means that you have the caregiver role for all GrandCare systems in that group. And that means that if a new GrandCare system gets added to that group, you as a group caregiver would automatically have a caregiving role on that system too. And finally, there's the distributor level. And that means that organization-wide, across your entire organization, you would have this administrative role across your distributorship. So groups, we'll talk a little bit more in a separate video about what that is, but really briefly, it's either one of two ways. Either you're a GrandCare provider who has a number of different customers, and some of those customers have more than one GrandCare system. You might make each of those customers a group so that they can manage their GrandCares all in one group like that. Or even more likely is if you're implementing GrandCare in your organization and you have different areas of your organization, like let's say you run a senior community and you have in one building or one wing of your building you have independent living, and in another you have assisted living. So you might make each of those a group unto themselves. And that's just a handy way of just sort of grouping together GrandCare systems for business purposes for that business unit. And it also has the benefit of automating your staffing, right? So if you have staff that just work in assisted living, well, then you can add them as group caregivers or group administrators and whatnot just for that group. And that you know that any new GrandCare unit that you add to that group, to your assisted living group, that all that same staff would have the same roles in it as they do for all the other GrandCares in that group. Now finally, let's take a really detailed look at these user roles. And by the way, all of this information is documented in the Help Wiki at help.grandcare.com. So if you're ever in any doubt about what role can do what and all that, you can go there at any time and review that. It can get a little complicated, so don't feel bad if you do need to review that. But let's just take a look at this here. Now you'll notice that in addition to, if you look on the left here, in addition to the distributor admin and then the groups and also account level users, there's also this one at the top that's just labeled admin server management. And what that means is that means typically that you work for GrandCare or you manage a server for Venezuela or something like that. It's not a typical role that you would have, but just so that you're aware that that's what that is. Now over on the right, here's the good stuff. Now, let's take it right down the line. The orange dots, the communicator role. They can log in, and so can the other roles. They can access the care menu, yep. They can share photos and letters and do video calls, and they might be able to receive alerts depending on whether you've chosen that or not, as we discussed earlier in this video. Now let's look at the green dots. That's the caregiver role. Well, they can do all those things, but they can also view activity charts and graphs. They can look at your wellness info, your medication stuff. They can add care notes about you. They can add and edit rules, and they can utilize the on-screen care plan with their touchscreen pin. Now look at the blue dots, the administrator role. You'll notice that they can do almost everything. And like we said before, they typically cannot receive alerts. If you have an administrator who needs to receive alerts on a particular group or a particular GrandCare unit, then you would have to add them a caregiver role to that group or that GrandCare to make sure that they were targetable by alerts for those things. And that's how it works. That is user roles. One more thing. about how to add a role for somebody. Obviously, you have to give them at least one role when you create their user in GC Manage, but sometimes people need more than one role, such as I mentioned, if maybe you're a group administrator and you want to be able to receive alerts for a particular GrandCare system. What do? Because administrators can't be targetable with alerts. So what you would do is you would go to that user's info page, you'd look them up in users, and this is the user I created earlier. And here's the role that this person has, and I could just use the add role button. So if I click it, it looks very similar to the section in the add user area where we chose a role for them. So I would choose a role that I wanted them to have, and I would be careful to select the correct account that I wanted them to be able to have that role on, and then I would just simply add that role. So I'll just do that now. I'll just add them that particular role, and now you can see there are multiple roles listed here on their roles tab. So there you have it.